There's always going to be risk in every instance, whether it's a data protection risk or it's a security risk. Hello everyone, welcome back to Privacy Professional Training. Today's video, we're going to be breaking down complex privacy and cybersecurity topics, making them easy for you to understand. So today's topic, we're going to be looking at the CISSP exam. So if you're preparing for the CISSP exam or even thinking about it, I wanted to address some of the key concepts that you're going to need to know before you sit for this exam. So a little bit of insight about the CISSP exam. It's actually offered by the ISC² consortium. So it's one of the most valuable certifications in the cybersecurity space, and it's very well respected, which is one of the reasons why I took it. I also took this exam because I wanted to be able to strengthen my knowledge on privacy data flow and how to protect data from a technical perspective. So one thing that us as privacy professionals do is not only do we look at data protection principles and also data protection laws, but there are components within the data protection laws that you need to grasp from a technical perspective, particularly when it comes to creating products, optimizing products, and particularly now given the artificial intelligence scope. So in order to pass this exam, you're going to need more than memorization. You're going to need to be able to understand core key concepts that show up across multiple domains for the exam. And it also helps you as a privacy professional to be able to understand the technical speak when you're speaking with engineers and different stakeholders that are creating some of these products. So in this particular video, I'm going to walk you through some of the key concepts that I had to grapple with when I was taking the exam. And we're going to go through 5. I might do a bonus at the end, but there are 5 key concepts I think every privacy professional should know if you work on the product side, and even if you're having discussions with different stakeholders for vendor tools, because it doesn't just look at internal tools that your client might be creating. You also need to be able to understand vendor tools that your organization might be acquiring. So that's why this is a very useful certification. So I want to explain a bit more about what these key concepts mean, why they matter for your understanding, and how generally they'll show up in different questions that you might encounter for the CISSP exam. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. So the first concept that we're going to be looking at is the CIA Triad, and some of the foundations for cybersecurity are confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So essentially, confidentiality means ensuring information is only accessible to those who are authorized. So when you think about confidentiality, you're thinking about things like encryption, access control, and data classification. Data classification is looking at things from sensitive to things that can be distributed, externally. When we look at integrity, we're looking at the fact that data must be accurate and complete and unaltered unless it's done through authorized processing. So what this looks like in a practical standpoint is things like hashing, digital signatures, and controlled change management, protecting integrity of documents, or it could be different assets. So availability means that systems and data have to be accessible when they're needed. When we think about availability, we're looking at redundancy, fault tolerance, load balancing, and disaster recovery strategies to help you maintain availability. So the reason that this concept matters is the CIA Triad is everywhere on the CISSP exam. Every security control, every risk decision, and every safeguard essentially ties back to whether there is protection from a confidentiality, integrity, or availability standpoint. So it's really important for students to understand these concepts very deeply. The second concept I want to talk about is defense in depth. And essentially what this means is it's really important for students that are studying for the test to understand that there needs to be in place different procedures and practices using different layers to protect from a security standpoint, so that if one security control fails, there's another that can stand in the balance. So whenever you have different types of assets, you need to make sure that you are defending those assets. And from a data protection standpoint, we look at this as different layers of protection if a bad actor is trying to gain access to an asset that stores personal data. So we can look at this as an example. Instead of an individual relying solely on a password, you can also add multi-factor authentication or intrusion detection, which I just mentioned. Network segmentation is also really useful, and endpoint protection, logging, and user training. All of these are really key layers for defending any type of asset that pertains to personal data. And the reason this is important for the exam is a lot of those CISSP questions often force you as the student to think beyond one single control. You're expected to want to design systems that are resilient even when something breaks. And that's really important when it comes to data protection, because the issues related to, breach and breach notifications, there are implications on that when it comes to defense in depth. And when we look at the CISSP, it's a risk-based mindset. You're looking at what is the most risk for the organization and how do I mitigate that. The third concept we're going to look at is risk management. So this is the third concept we're going to talk about for this video. You as a student need a solid understanding of risk management, right? The CISSP is not just a technical certification. It's a leadership level certification. That means the exam wants you to think like a security manager making decisions based on risk. So you're going to be presented with scenarios about different risky activities potentially, and you need to be thinking about what is the best security measure to put in place to mitigate that risk. There's always going to be risk in every instance, whether it's a data protection risk or it's a security risk. So some of the key risk management concepts you have to understand for the test can be threats. And a threat is something that could cause harm. A vulnerability, on the other hand, are weaknesses that allow threats to be exploited. And in order to look at both concepts, you need to look at the likelihood. How probable is it that a risk occurs, right? We know that there are bad actors out there. That can't be helped. What you need to look at as a professional is, how can I mitigate that risk? How can I mitigate the impact? How bad would the damage be if a particular action is taken? And then in addition to this, we need to look at risk treatment. Are you going to accept the risk, avoid it, transfer it, or mitigate it? So there's lots of things that come within that risk management bucket, and you're going to be presented with scenarios that require you to evaluate the level of risk associated with different activities that happen within an organization. Now, because security and privacy work hand in hand, there's going to be an overlap in terms of discussion around that risk management. How valuable is the data that's in a specific repository? The fourth concept we want to look at is access control, right? Now, access control models generally will show up on the exam because they define how an organization manages who gets access to what. Now, this is really important because when we look at security, we're looking at the assets, and those assets generally contain at least some personal data. We're looking at maybe usernames, passwords. The IT department is generally going to have the highest level of access. But if you're a customer support worker, then the level of access you're going to need is going to be different. Now, some different models associated with access could be discretionary access control, which is where a resource owner decides who gets access. Now, this is flexible, but it's less secure. And as part of this model, we could also look at mandatory access control, which is where access is based on classifications like confidential or top risk. And generally, this is issued to administrators, and there are very specific permissions, and this is quite strict. And I talked about this when it comes to, the IT team. They're more likely to have those mandatory access controls because they have access to so much of the data. Now, there's another key model, role-based access control. And this is basically where users get permissions based on their job roles. And this is probably the most common form of a model that's used at most organizations. Something else that's quite unique about, the different models is the attribute-based access control, which is where access depends on attributes. So if you're a user, a resource, an environment, or action, you're going to have access control based on those attributes. And this is generally very dynamic. So the reason that this matters for the exam is because you're often going to be asked about access control models that fit a given scenario. For example, it might be that there is an asset in a military environment or a corporate environment, and you're going to be able to determine which access control model suits a different environment. Now, the last concept we're going to look at are security, governance, and policies. It's really important for organizations and you and your understanding of taking the CISSP exam, being able to understand what security governance looks like and how it might differ depending on the organization. And this is a very strategic part of cybersecurity. Having a structure, having policies, having leadership, all these processes set the tone for an entire security program, and as such influence the privacy program. Now, some of the key elements associated with a governance program are the policies. These are generally high-level statements of management intent. For example, employees must protect sensitive data. Now, how are they going to do that? Through issuing those access controls for certain identifiers depending on who needs access to the sensitive data. A standard, this is mandatory rules that support those policies. A procedure, step-by-step instructions for individuals for certain activities. And then guidelines, finally, that are just recommended practices but are not mandatory. And sometimes you'll see these frameworks in things like the ISO 27001, NIST SP 853, COBIT, etc., etc. Now, this is really useful because the CISSP it asks about lots of different concepts. You're asked about a lot of different concepts, not in depth, but you're going to need to have understanding of lots of different concepts. And there's lots of different frameworks associated with governance from a security perspective. And governance questions are going to focus on enabling the business while ensuring covering, accountability, due care, and due diligence. So I know that was a lot of different concepts, but the CISSP is very, very involved. It's one of the most difficult security certifications I personally have taken. If you're looking at resources that I used to study for this test, take a look at the cards above. I've done a whole video about how I prepared for the exam in less than 60 days. So I really hope this particular video helps you with your understanding of the CISSP and key concepts you should know before taking the test. And I'll see you in another video.